George Zimmerman appeared for the first time Thursday in a Florida courtroom. We brought it to you live. He faces second-degree murder in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. A judge saying yesterday that there is probable cause to move ahead with the case. A man now known to all but shrouded in so much mystery finally heard for the first time yesterday. We are in first position with the latest.
You are represented by Mr. O'Mara, is that true?
Yes, sir.
Now, investigators seeking a second-degree murder charge because they believe Zimmerman, quote, profiled Trayvon Martin, assuming he was a criminal, and then followed him. In order to convict someone of second-degree murder in the state of Florida, three things have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. One, victim's dead. Two, the death was caused by the criminal act of the defendant. And three, there was an unlawful killing of the victim by an act imminently dangerous to another and demonstrating a depraved mind without regard for human life. Maximum sentence, life in prison, minimum 25 years. It's a charge that some say the prosecutors are going to have a hard time proving. Now, in the meantime, Zimmerman's attorney says that his client is expressing remorse for his actions.
George fully well realizes that he was involved in some way in the death of another young man. He does not take the result of that altercation lightly at all.
O'Mara also says that Zimmerman open to speaking directly to the Martin family here. Zimmerman, he is reportedly being kept in isolation for his own security. All right, joining us to break down these latest developments and much more, our good friend Rob Simmons, former Republican congressman from Connecticut. We're also joined by Richard Klein, a professor at Toro Law, Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, Troy Smith, who you saw earlier this week, former New York City homicide prosecutor and a criminal defense attorney, and our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman. Guys, thank you very much here. And let's get right into the charge, and I'll start with you, Mr. Klein. Were you surprised? Did you think they were going to go with manslaughter, or did you think, at least with what we know, second-degree murder was a charge that the prosecution can convict on?
I thought they would go with second-degree murder. I think second-degree murder is the appropriate charge. And I think that the prosecutor wouldn't have gone ahead in such a highly publicized matter and gone and sought to convict Zimmerman on this count unless the prosecutor felt that she could indeed show beyond a reasonable doubt that George Zimmerman is guilty of first-degree murder. So I think it was appropriate. I think the elements of the crime are there. I would expect, even though it's impossible to predict, and I think one thing we got to just get on the table from the beginning is that we don't know all the facts, and if we keep saying we don't know all the facts, we're not going to be able to get any place really. We don't know all the facts. It's impossible to predict whether there can be a conviction when there is so much that we don't know. But given that what we do know at this point, to me, seems to substantiate a murder in the second-degree charge.
Troy, you were a prosecutor for a long time, prosecuted homicides. When the public looks at this, should they remember that just because you start with second-degree murder, that's not how you necessarily have to finish? And the prosecution has this in mind. There could be, you know, a deal between now and even trial, let alone when they actually get to a sentencing phase.
Of course, just because Mr. Zimmerman is not charged right now with manslaughter doesn't mean that we can't end up with manslaughter. Possible plea bargain down the road could end up in a plea of guilty to manslaughter. Also, as I indicated previously, if the case should go to trial, manslaughter is a lesser charge, a lesser included offense of murder in the second degree, and it is possible that if the jury wasn't convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that George Zimmerman was guilty of murder in the second degree, they could, of course, convict of manslaughter.
Right. Now, you've looked at the case, and obviously we don't know all the facts. Trial hasn't been started, but if you're that special prosecutor in Florida, what's the best cards you're holding right now? I mean, the world knows. To me, the fact that the cops told this guy basically, stand down here, don't get involved, but he disregarded the advice of the police and pursued it at this point, at least with what we understand. Is that, in addition to the fact that the kid had Skittles and a Coke in his pants, I mean, that's what the jury's going to be in the back of their head. We all know the facts about what happened. Are those the two biggest elements that they're going to have to wrestle with?
Well, that 911 call that was made by George Zimmerman is rather damning, in which he indicates he used some profanity to describe the individual Trayvon Martin, and he was told directly to not follow him, and he disregarded that. And I think a big strategy in this case was from the get-go, and jury selection is conveying to the jury, the law tells us not to take matters into our own hands. And Mr. Zimmerman just did that. And the reason we tell people that, citizens, that is not just for people like George Zimmerman, but also for the victim, in this case, Trayvon Martin, okay, not to take the matters into their own hands. And he did exactly that.
I think, if I should say something, when we look at what the law is regarding self-defense, there's a concept called the initial aggressor. The person who starts it all is less able to use a defensive self-defense. And I think the fact here that it seems to be clear that in spite of what the police dispatcher said, George Zimmerman got out of his car and, according to the accusatory instrument yesterday, confronted Trayvon Martin. That goes a long way to showing, really, that it was started by or was prompted by what George Zimmerman was.
But how much, Richard, does stand your ground complicate issues here?
Well, I don't think this really is so much about stand your ground. I think it's much more a traditional kind of self-defense, because it boils down to whether or not a reasonable person in George Zimmerman's place would have felt that he was endangered with the imminent use of great force against him were he not to have acted in self-defense.
Dominic, I'm surprised by some of the poll numbers that came out. Andrew, what was it that a third of the public here doesn't think that there's going to be a conviction whatsoever?
Yeah, it's 33% don't, or it's 33 or 30. I get there. It is. 33% think he'll be found guilty of murder. 30% say he is guilty of murder. So more people think he'll be convicted than actually think he is guilty. 24% thought it was self-defense. 46% not sure. I should point out that's through Rasmussen, which is generally a conservative leaning pollster.
Dominic, some say it was almost as significant that he got charged at all because of what we've seen here since the shooting, let alone what eventually happens to him. You buy that, or if there is an inevitable justice, there's going to be a lot of outrage in a lot of communities?
I think I agree mostly with what has already been articulated by the council. But as I said the other night when this first came down, I don't think this special prosecutor would have went with murder 2 unless she feels she has an almost airtight case to get a conviction. And, when you look at all the evidence, it seems to me that it points against Mr. Zimmerman. They're going to bring in experts to say that it was his voice, that it was Trayvon Martin's voice screaming for help. They're going to do all types of things. That 911 tape, as Counselor just indicated, is extremely damaging. You would think that if you're Zimmerman's lawyer, and I don't go by public opinion polls, especially on something like this, you can get polls to say almost anything you want. So I wouldn't go by that at all. In this case, politics, yes, but not this case.
I'll just point out, prosecutors thought they had a slam dunk case in the Rodney King case. They thought they had a slam dunk case in the OJ case. Those were all cases that led to actions or reactions after the verdicts went the other way.
And what's very surprising is that in some of these highly publicized cases where one assumes that the media has given such a slant, and when the trial starts, people think there's bound to be a conviction, very often the jurors just take their responsibility much more carefully than one would think they were, and don't come in there with such a bias, but rather really do look to see whether or not the case has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
It's going to be fascinating to see how this all plays out. We haven't even gotten into, whether or not there's going to be a push for a change of venue, let alone the jury selection. Can you find 12 people in the state of Florida who don't know the facts about this case and the racial makeup of the jury? Oh, this is going to keep us busy for a while.